Hello, BookTube. We're continuing on with my library tour as part of OGBG, the Old Geezers Book Group. I'm sure by now you're all collecting your fan magazines and you're putting posters up on your wall and you're having friendly arguments about which of the four of us. There are four of us, BookTube's new Fab Four. There's Mark Richardson, there's Todd's Bursting Bookcase, there's Jason Harrigan, and there's me. And I'm sure you're all having long discussion board debates over which of us is the cute one, and which of us is the serious one, and which of us is the intellectual one, and which of us is Ringo. And I'm continuing on. It's just a rare confluence of events that all four of us are doing gigantic library tours at the same time. And I am touring now the Little Book Room. This is my heart and soul. This is where I come to recharge my batteries. This is a space that everybody needs. Now, I'm lucky because my surly houseboy has allowed me to make pretty much the whole of this place a place where I can recharge my batteries. I have wonderful little landing spot, nesting areas in every part of Hyde Cottage. But that hasn't always been the case. Plenty of times that has not been the case. And I bet it's not always the case for you either. And so I want to stress, I've hit this in AuthorTube videos that I've made, I want to stress the importance of having a place like this. But as you might guess from my little book room, it's full of books. So we're doing this first bookcase. We're going to do the transverse books first and try and get this done in an expeditious manner. Okay, all right, this is yet another book on the Princes in the Tower. This is Bertram Field's Royal Blood. Does not belong here. It's just another book on the subject of the nephews of Richard III and, their fate, and all that we know about them and all the argument that's been happening ever since. Where I'm putting these books when I'm done with them is, this is kind of an issue here now. Kind of don't like to reach off camera when I'm talking to you, but what is this next? Oh, all right, this next one is newish. This is Dinosaurs Rediscovered by Michael Benton. Terrific book on dinosaurs. Terrific. Glad that I kept it. Glad it's in this room. It deserves to be. There's hardly any kind of book more vulnerable to being totally outdated than dinosaur books. And yet I have two of them in this room, three of them actually. And the reason why I have all three in this room is because they don't rely on up-to-the-minute discoveries, despite the fact that two of them are very much about up-to-the-minute discoveries. Once you dig into them, you realize the authors are perfectly happy to just write about dinosaurs. The concept of dinosaurs, the science of looking for them, and all that sort of stuff. And that dates a lot less than here is the new information on what T-Rex looked like. Plus, Benton's a terrific prose stylist, just to be around. Okay, this is Arlene Thomas. This is Bird Ambulance. Her wonderful old book about taking care of, she was a softie, and she took care of every single damaged or in need bird that came her way in the entire course of her life, and was finally prevailed upon to write a book about it all. It's got black and white photos. I wonder how well that you'd never be able to tell from the black. Okay, here we go. There's a falcon in traction. Oh, you'd never be able to tell from the blasting light behind me. The blasting light behind me, I am convinced. Now, after a few months of it just being omnipresent, I'm convinced that it is actually a divine phenomenon. So, but you would never guess. It is as dark as night outside right now. It is as dark as twilight. It's an incredibly humid, incredibly rainy day here in Boston. It doesn't look anything like that. That is divine. a sign of divine favor, I would assume. I hope. Oh, all right. Well, this next one's a classic. You will have seen it in every yard sale that you've ever gone to. If you've passed it up, you should buy it next time for a quarter and sink in with it. It's well worth your time. This is the Essays of E.B. White. There are little collections like that of his letters. There are little collections of his essays. I think the essays are just wonderful. Some of them have been reprinted millions of times, but I love them. I love them a lot more than anything else that he ever wrote. What have we? This next one's thin. Oh, okay. This is Margaret Stanger. This is That Quail Robert. A classic book in which a woman takes in a quail. Again, in distress, an egg. and Robert grows up in the family. Exhibits a personality, exhibits all sorts of great personality traits when he's not under stress, when he knows he's loved, when he knows this is his home. And what results is a classic book, right on the same shelf with H is for Hawk or Owl is that Quail Robert. Just amazing. That and Arnie the Darling Starling, which I don't know if I have it here in this room. I hope I do. Oh, okay. All right. Well, we've commented before that I really should have an entire shelf or two of books about Venice. I used to live in Venice. I had a wonderful rambling old apartment in Venice. And this would be on it, and so would the next one. This is Danielle Varey's Ghosts of the Rialto. Just an old picture book full of standard stories. You know, Lord Byron, all that sort of stuff about Venice. All the stuff that at the time, this is in, I think, the 1950s. Had you gone to Venice at the time, your guide would, 1956, your guide would have simply regaled you with all of these stories. The stories have largely stayed the same, but they have no historical merit whatsoever. This is just, the only reason that I have this is because it writes with such glowing love for Venice. And the same thing is true with this one. This is Pompeo Momenti. This is Venice, another 1950s guidebook. This one equally has lavish black and white illustrations. I tend to collect, sometimes not really in the sense of being complete about it, but I tend to like to have lots of books about places that I have lived and loved. I have a lot on Boston. I have a lot on Venice. Okay. All right. And I also have a lot on Washington, D.C. I used to live and work in Washington, D.C. a long time ago. And I fell in love with the place. I'm free to admit that, even though it wasn't my kind of place at all. It was full of ambitious climbers, and the weather. BookTube, if you haven't been to Washington in the summer, I don't know how to explain it to you. I don't know how to explain it to you. When you walk around Washington, D.C. in the summer, you are vividly, viscerally reminded that the whole place was built on a swamp, an actual swamp, not a political swamp. The heat and humidity in Washington, D.C. in high summer, you would think all those things would combine to make me hate it, but I loved my Washington interlude. I absolutely loved it. Not always at the time, but in retrospect, yes, absolutely. And here you have why. Here you have a whole bunch of books that show that, because I never pass up a Washington book. This is Helen Nicolay's book, Our Capital on the Potomac. Wonderful illustrated old hardcover of Washington. And then this must be Mrs. Logan. Yes. Yes, this is Mrs. John Logan. This is 30 Years in Washington. Her book, same thing, full of illustrations and photographs of what Washington was like 100 years ago, when the politics was brutal, but the personal element of living in the city was so much nicer, so much better than it is today. Today, I've mentioned before on this channel many times, there was a peculiar taxonomic phenomenon known as the Washington Society Matron. These women who basically ruled the city, they held parties. There was one almost every week. There were cold cut lunches and high teas and whatnot almost every day. And you went there. You had your circles, but the circles blended, the circles intermixed. And your party affiliation was largely checked at the door. It was a very important function. You could go there and actually have a conversation with a bitter political enemy of yours about an issue that you needed to resolve. One way or another, you needed to resolve it. You could go and talk to this person, and you could not resort to invective. You certainly could not resort to profanity or violence, because the Washington social matron and all of her fellow Biddy Beans were right there in the room. And it isn't that they had paper-thin sensibilities at all. It's not like they would have fainted. What they would have done is destroy you. They had the ability, with a simple word in the ear of the right people, to destroy you in a more thorough way than any enemy on the Senate floor could do. And every man at those parties knew that. Every man at those functions knew that. That if the big diplomatic circle end-of-the-year gala parties are starting to kick up all around town and out in Silver Spring and whatnot, and you're not invited to any of them, you and your wife are pointedly snubbed, your social currency in Washington is gone. And these women had complete control over that fund of money, over that particular currency. And every man at their parties knew that. There were decades where a lot of seasoned politicians in Washington, D.C. at the turn of the 20th century firmly believed and said off record that side of Washington was the only thing that kept the other side working. And they would have been horrified at the state of affairs now, where those kinds of social parties, first of all, they're much smaller, they're much less grand usually, and they're intensely partisan. You don't see any political enemies at those parties at all anymore. I think that might be a large contributor to what the current state of politics is like in America. It's kind of interesting to think. Most of those society matrons, I'm not sure that Helen Nicolai, maybe not, but most of those Washington matrons, those mansion holders out in Bethesda or whatever, most of them would have been violently against women's right to vote. And they were violently, militantly against women participating directly in politics, women in Congress. They absolutely hated the idea. And it wasn't because they were shrinking violets. They weren't wallflowers. They weren't thinking, oh, we don't think straight. They knew perfectly well from seeing these men in their cups, in their own houses, that they thought a lot better than the men, a lot more clearly at all times, even when they were in their cups. It wasn't that at all. It was that I'm sure that a lot of these women, had you asked them, had they been able to look forward, 125 years, I'm sure that their objection would have been, well, if you blend those two worlds, then we're going to have to act just as bad as the men. And there won't be any of this recovery period at our own parties. It'll all be politics all the time. I think a lot of them would have thought that, and they would have turned out to be right, at least in terms of that. I don't know. It's an interesting subject, and no one has done it justice in a book that I know of. There is no great, gigantic Summa Theologica Women in Washington book that I know of. There should be. There should be at least a shelf full of really good studies of these society matrons and the world they ran. And I would say those studies should have been written half a century ago, because the documentation is going away. A lot of times there isn't any documentation, but what there is the people who hold the anecdotes that will allow you to know whose attic has the trove of letters that no one's ever seen. Those people are slowly dying or losing their minds to dementia, and that once that's gone, that doesn't come back. There's no way to piece it all together in an accurate way. Instead, it'll be a historian's way. I wish that were the case. I wish that there were studies like that. And as far as I know, there aren't any. If there are, let me know. Okay. All right, this is a lovely thing. This is Everyday Life in Washington. Still has some of the gold gilding on the cover. That's kind of strange, considering this must be a century old. What is this? When was this made? Dare I ask? 1900. 1900. Oh my. All right. And this has everything. This has candid snaps of the movers and shakers of the day, but also how the mail system works, how all the different branches of government work together, who's in them, how big the staffing is, that sort of thing. Very interesting. For me, I should say, because I'm sure that plenty of you right now are saying, that doesn't sound interesting. Okay, and this is the last one. This is Edward Lowry's Washington Close-Ups. So that's 4 books in a row on Washington. And I think this came out in the 1920s. Was this the 1920s? No, you're not going to tell me? 1921. And Ed Lowry was an incredible observer, an incredible people watcher, and also something of an intellectual fixture on Martha's Vineyard, a resort island off the coast of Massachusetts, where I am a book reviewer now, and where once upon a time there's a particular kind of longing that the vineyard induces in people. The longing is to return to the vineyard. So you're away, you're back in town in Washington or New York or Boston, and you're doing your stuff. You're doing what you do to earn your living, but you are yearning. There's a part of you yearning to go back to the vineyard, open up the house, and move into the vineyard rhythm of life. There's a very present, an omnipresent yearning to do that. I don't know, now that I think of it off the top of my head, I don't know if Edward Lowry ever wrote a book about the vineyard. I wonder if he did. I'll have to check and see. I don't even know where I'd look. I'm pretty sure that it had been out of print for 100 years, so I'm not sure that you'd find it on Amazon. Boy, I know that he often talked about writing a book about the vineyard, but I don't know that he ever did. Huh. Well, isn't this a pure sign of how fascinating these book tours will be? We're just going to keep going. This little book room is where I make no apologies whatsoever for the non-fashionability of what's on these shelves. They're largely mixed together in no order, and they are books for me. They are books that I love. But that's it for now. We end with a barrage of books on Washington, D.C. So I'm gonna wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.